Oh my gosh, I did it again. Just popped a caramel in my mouth, knowing I'm going to read. Sorry. I'm going to leave the lights off, y'all. A storm just blew through here. Ooh, I was scared. I was doing some powerful praying, and the Lord was holding my hands, both of them. I just envisioned the protective angels all around my mobile home, because, y'all, I heard sounds I have never heard before. You know how they say it sounds like a train when a tornado's coming. It didn't sound like that, but it was eerie. Very eerie. Well, I got 44% on this Kindle, so I better start reading. Ga, said Betty with enormous satisfaction and beat with a spoon on the table. Tuppence said with a twinkle, "What does Nazar really mean?" Mrs. Sprott said with a flush, "I'm afraid, you know, it's what Betty says when she doesn't like anyone or anything." "I rather thought so," said Tuppence. Both women laughed. "After all," said Mrs. Sprott, "Mrs. O'Rourke means to be kind, but she is rather alarming, with that deep voice and the beard and everything." With her head on one side, Betty made a cooing noise at Tuppence. "She has taken to you, Mrs. Blankensop." What a name. Said Mrs. Sprott, another name. There was a slight jealous chill Tuppence fancied in her voice. Tuppence hastened to adjust matters. "They always like a new face, don't they?" she said easily. The door opened and Major Bletchley and Tommy appeared. Tuppence became arch. Or arc. "Ah, Mr. Meadows," she called out. "I've beaten you, you see. First past the post. But I've left you just a little breakfast." She indicated with the faintest of gestures the seat beside her, Tommy muttering vaguely, thanks. Sat down at the other end of the table. Betty Sprott said, "Putch," with a fine splutter of milk at Major Bletchley, whose face instantly assumed a sheepish but delighted expression. "Oh, how's little Miss Bo Peep this morning?" he asked. Bo Peep, he enacted the play with a newspaper, Betty crowed with delight. Serious misgivings shook Tuppence. She thought, there must be some mistake. There can't be anything going on here. There simply can't. To believe in Sansucci as a headquarters of the fifth column needed the mental equipment of the White Queen and Alice. That's all of two. And I have a sore throat, y'all. The sinus postnasal drip ain't no joke. Chapter 3. On the sheltered terrace outside, Miss Minton was knitting. Miss Minton was thin and angular. Her neck was stringy. She wore pale sky blue jumpers and chains or bead necklaces. Her skirts were tweedy and had a depressed droop at the back. She greeted Tuppence with alacrity. "Good morning, Mrs. Blankensop. I do hope you slept well." Mrs. Blankensop confessed that she never slept very well the first night or two in a strange bed. Miss Minton said, "Now wasn't that curious? It was exactly the same with her." Mrs. Blankensop said, "What a coincidence, and what a very pretty stitch that was." Miss Minton, flushing with pleasure, displayed it. Yes, it was rather uncommon, and really quite simple. She could easily show it to Mrs. Blankensop if Mrs. Blankensop liked. Oh, that was very kind of Miss Minton, but Mrs. Blankensop was so stupid she wasn't really very good at knitting. Not at following patterns, that was to say. She could only do simple things like balaclava helmets, and even now she was afraid she had gone wrong somewhere. It didn't look right somehow, did it? Miss Minton cast an expert eye over the khaki mass. Gently she pointed out just what had gone wrong. Thankfully, Tuppence handed the faulty helmet over. Miss Minton exuded kindness and patronage. Oh, no, it wasn't a trouble at all. She had knitted for so many years. I'm afraid I've never done any before this dreadful war, confessed Tuppence, but one feels so terribly, doesn't one, that one must do something. Oh, yes, indeed, and you actually have a boy in the Navy, I think I heard you say last night. Yes, my eldest boy, such a splendid boy he is, though I suppose a mother shouldn't say so. Then I have a boy in the Air Force, and Cyril, my baby, is out in France. Oh, dear, dear, how terribly anxious you must be. Tuppence thought, oh, Derek, my darling Derek, out in the hell and mess, and here I am playing the full act in the thing. I'm really feeling, she said in her most righteous voice. We must all be brave, mustn't we? Let's hope it'll all be over soon. I was told the other day on a very high authority indeed that the Germans can't possibly last out more than another 2 months. Miss Minton nodded with so much vigor that all her bead chains rattled and shook. Yes, indeed, I believe, her voice lowered mysteriously, that Hitler is suffering from a disease absolutely fatal. He'll be raving mad by August, Tuppence replied briskly. All this blitzkrieg is just the Germans' last effort. I believe the shortage is something frightful in Germany. The men in the factories are very dissatisfied. The whole thing will crack up. What's this? What's all this? Mr. and Mrs. Cayley came out on the terrace, Mr. Cayley putting his questions fretfully. He settled himself in a chair and his wife put a rug over his knees. He repeated fretfully, What's that you're saying? We're saying, said Miss Minton, that it will all be over by the autumn. Nonsense, said Mr. Cayley. This war's going to last at least 6 years. Oh, Mr. Cayley, protested Tuppence, you don't really think so. Mr. Cayley was peering about him suspiciously. Now I wonder, he murmured, is there a drought? Perhaps it would be better if I moved my chair back into the corner. No, draft. That's the way it's spelled. Back into the corner. The resettlement of Mr. Cayley took place. His wife, an anxious-faced woman who seemed to have no other aim in life than to minister to Mr. Cayley's wants. That's my little thing I've been working on. Oh, Lord, that clock. Hopefully it was correct. Let's see. I didn't know. I didn't listen to it. 9. It should be. Where am I? Back into the corner. The resettlement of Mr. Cayley took place. His wife, an anxious-faced woman who seemed to have no other aim in life than... I just said that. Minister to Mr. Cayley's wants, manipulating cushions and rugs, asking from time to time, how is that, Alfred? Do you think that will be all right? Ought you perhaps to have your sunglasses? There is rather a glare this morning, Mr. Cayley said irritably. No, no, don't fuss, Elizabeth. Have you got my muffler? No, my silk muffler. Oh, well, it doesn't matter. I dare say this will do for once, but I don't want to get my throat overheated, and wool in this sunlight, well, perhaps you'd better fetch the other. He turned his attention back to matters of public interest. Yes, he said, I give it 6 years. He listened with pleasure to the protest of the 2 women. You dear ladies are just indulging in what we call wishful thinking. Now, I know Germany. I may say I know Germany extremely well. In the course of my business before I retired, I used to be constantly to and fro. Berlin, Hamburg, Munich, I know them all. I can assure you that Germany can hold out practically indefinitely with Russia behind her. Mr. Cayley plunged triumphantly on, his voice rising and falling in pleasurably melancholy cadences, only interrupted when he paused to receive the silk muffler his wife brought him and wind it around his throat. Mrs. Sprott brought out Betty and plumped her down with a small woolen dog that lacked an ear and a woolly doll's jacket. "There, Betty," she said, "you dress up Bonzo ready for his walk, while Mummy gets ready to go out." Mr. Cayley's voice droned on, reciting statistics and figures, all of a depressing character. The monologue was punctuated by a cheerful twittering from Betty, talking busily to Bonzo in her own language. "Truckle, truckly, pop, bat," said Betty. Then, as a bird alighted near her, she stretched out loving hands to it and gurgled. The bird flew away, and Betty glanced round the assembled company and remarked clearly, "Dickie," and nodded her head with great satisfaction. "That child is learning to talk in the most wonderful way," said Miss Minton. "Say ta-ta, Betty, ta-ta." Betty looked at her coldly and remarked, "Gluck." Then she forced Bonzo's one arm into his woolly coat and, toddling over to a chair, picked up the cushion and pushed Bonzo behind it. Chuckling gleefully, she said with terrific pains, "Hide, Bow Wow, hide." Miss Minton, acting as a kind of interpreter, said with vicarious pride, "She loves hide and seek. She's always hiding things." She cried out with exaggerated surprise, "Where's Bonzo? Where's Bonzo? Where can Bonzo have gone?" Betty flung herself down and went into ecstasies of mirth. Mr. Cayley, finding attention diverted from his explanation of Germany's methods of substitution of raw materials, looked put out and coughed aggressively. Mrs. Sprott came out with her hat on and picked up Betty. Attention returned to Mr. Cayley. "You were saying, Mr. Cayley," said Tuppence. But Mr. Cayley was affronted. He said coldly, "That woman is always plumping that child down and expecting people to look after it. I think I'll have the woolen muffler after all, dear. The sun's going." I have to smack him upside the head. "Oh, but Mr. Cayley, do go on with what you were telling us. It's so interesting," said Miss Minton. Mollified, Mr. Cayley weightily resumed his discourse, drawing the folds of the woolly muffler closer round his stringy neck. "As I was saying, Germany has so perfected her system of—" Tuppence turned to Mrs. Cayley and asked, "What do you think about the war, Mrs. Cayley?" Mrs. Cayley jumped. "Oh, well, what do I think? What do you mean? Do you think it will last as long as 6 years?" Mrs. Cayley said doubtfully, "Oh, I hope not. It's a very long time, isn't it?" "Yes, a long time. What do you really think?" Mrs. Cayley seemed quite alarmed by the question. She said, I don't know. I don't know at all. Alfred says it will. But you don't think so?" "Oh, I don't know. It's difficult to say, isn't it?" Tuppence felt a wave of exasperation, the chirruping Miss Minton, the dictatorial Mr. Cayley, the nit-witted Mrs. Cayley. Were these people really typical of her fellow countrymen? Was Mrs. Sprott any better with her slightly vacant face and boiled gooseberry eyes? I was like boiled gooseberries. What could she, Tuppence, ever find out here? Not one of these people, surely. Her thought was checked. She was aware of a shadow, someone behind her who stood between her and the sun. She turned her head, Mrs. Perrina standing on the terrace, her eyes on the group, and something in those eyes. Scorn? Was it? The kind of withering contempt Tuppence thought, I must find out more about Mrs. Perina. And then there's a second part to this chapter, so I'll stop right there. I think it's about to die anyway. I only read 15 minutes. I'm so sorry, and I'm sorry I skip night sometimes. When I do that, I've just waited too late. And this is just impossible. So, I need to do it earlier in the day, and I mean to, and it just keeps getting later and later. I love y'all. Be sweet, don't be ugly. Mwah. Pray for my throat. Love y'all. Bye-bye.